Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining me for today's webinar, Think Workflow, Not App, where I'm delighted to be joined by Scott Logic's Innovation Director, Graham Odds. If you have a question for Graham, pop it into the question box and we'll take as many as we can at the end. You'll also notice that we're going to do something a bit different today, which you may have seen us do on a previous webinar, as we'll be supporting the Altitude Foundation through today's event. So how do we support a charity by watching a webinar, I hear you ask? Well, we'll be giving £5 for every completed survey that we'll ask you to complete at the end of the webinar. The Altitude Foundation is a charity that is very close to our hearts, as it was set up by Scott Logic just over a year ago with the aim of helping disadvantaged kids who have a passion for technology to smash barriers and achieve a successful career. Because of COVID-19, it's never been more important to support the amazing work that these guys do. Charities have been hit hard by the crisis, and the children that this charity was set up to help have been disproportionately affected by the economic effects and the school closures. So please join us in supporting this cause by completing your survey, and we'll be able to see just how much we've managed to raise at the end. So let me now introduce you to today's speaker. Graham Odds has been at Scott Logic for 14 years, and over that time he's been a developer, a user experience designer, and a general thorn in the side of anyone who doesn't like change. His extensive work on research, analytics, and trading platforms across capital markets, physical commodities, and energy, combined with his deep personal interest in data visualization, have repeatedly proven his capability to make the complex consumable by both experts and lay people alike. Today, he's hoping to share some of his not at all secret sauce. So without any further delay, over to you, Graham.
Thank you very much, Claire. That was a very nice introduction. Thank you. I guess that sets some good background about who I am. I guess just to re-emphasize that point about this sort of mixed background I've got of both on the technical side and on the more design side. I tend to err towards the more design side these days, just because there's so many other people at Scott Logic who know the technology bit way better than I do. And that's going to be the same for this webinar. So I'm going to not get too technical, basically. I will touch on it, but not going to get too deep in there. I think also just some context to this particular topic is that this is part of a broader sort of theme that we're exploring with a series of webinars and a white paper and stuff all around how we cultivate tomorrow's integrated desktop ecosystem. So the URL we've got up on the screen there, that's a link to sort of the landing page with the other webinars that we've done, videos of those that are some very technical, some not so much, and also a white paper and some other bits and pieces. And I'll signpost to possibly some of those bits and pieces as we go along. But I guess to get started, hopefully this is a somewhat familiar picture to a lot of you. This is pretty much the floor of any financial or commodities trading institution, and you walk that floor and you look around, and yeah, it's as complicated as it looks, really. It's loads of fast-moving information, lots of different things that different people are doing at the same time. It's just so much going on. And the overarching theme of complexity is really key there, and it's what's so different to many other walks of life. And I think that a lot of the technology in those places, reflects that complexity. I mean, the telephones, for starters, tend to be one of the most intimidating things there, and yet it's just a telephone. But when I look closer, often what I see is that the technology doesn't just reflect that complexity, it exacerbates it quite a lot. You end up with all these sort of heterogeneous systems, and the people on the other end of them have to sort of battle them into submission quite often, sometimes almost literally. These people, the people doing these jobs, they know what they're trying to do, they know their intent, they have a goal in mind or whatever, and then they have to sort of fight with these tools to help them achieve that. They have to use the tools to achieve them, but they don't always want to. Lots of the things they're trying to do end up with these really sort of brittle workflows, as I talk about it. I guess an example is, how often do you see someone potentially rekeying the same instrument name into a bunch of different systems? They want to pop up a chart of it, or they have to type in the instrument name or some identifier, or they want to uh, enter an order for it. Oh, they have to rekey it there again, or they're doing some other research in another tool, they have to enter it there again. And the traders and the users, they get exceptionally good using muscle memory to sort of work through these workflows, but they're still pretty brittle. All along the chain, there's places things can fall down, and what they keep having to do is they keep sort of having to project what's going on in their mind back into yet another tool. And I guess I see an awful lot of what we end up with is this path on the left, where more and more the work that people are doing is actually driven by the tools that they're given, rather than the tools being a supporting aid for the work that they do. People end up almost subservient to those tools, and just spending all their time wrangling those instead of interpreting or anticipating markets or responding to clients' needs, or whatever it is that they do. That should be their job, not fighting with technology. And how this often comes about is it's actually very understandable and very reasonable. From the development teams, often ones I'm on, or yourselves are often involved with, we're trying to build out, some piece of functionality, some application, whatever it is, and we actually could be, wonderfully considerate of that user, and we're saying like, okay, how can we get them to do this thing that this app does the best possible way? And we've seen real progress in that across the domain over the last 5-10 years, that we really do think about the users in that sense. But the thinking, it still ends up fairly siloed. We're so focused on the app that we're making, the functionality that we're developing. We don't necessarily recognize the user typically has a much broader context. I mean, we make this one little app as awesome as we can, but from the user's point of view, it's just one of many that they're using to try and achieve their goals. It's very, very rare that one app is the destination for a user. Typically, it's a stop on some longer, broader journey that they're trying to do. And the tools are just there to help them achieve those intents, and we shouldn't sort of limit them at all. So I say this, and I'm being possibly unfair. I do recognize that there's quite a lot of applications out there that do recognize that this is complicated and that people have different intents and they have different likes and dislikes. But what they tend to do, from what I see and what I have to discuss and argue with people we work with, is that they say, okay, well, let's give customizability, let's give configurability, let's let the user set it up the way they want and use it the way they want. Sounds lovely and sounds very empowering. I argue, though, that that's effectively just outsourcing your design problem to the user. You're saying, well, yeah, they probably know how to do what they want to do. And sometimes there's truth in that, but the reality is that that's not their sort of specialism. They're not experts in this. They pretty much, most of the time, use the defaults, right? We all use some kind of operating system, Windows or Mac OS typically. They're very, very configurable, very, very customizable. Just have a think about how many times you've tweaked those settings to make it work better for you, and how much you've actually just stuck with the defaults. And I bet you it's mostly just the defaults. So really what I argue is that we need to stop being lazy, and we need to stop making the user the designer, and we should do the hard work for them. And so obviously the solution is we need to be able to read their minds. Unfortunately, a bit of tin foil and some coat hangers is not the way to do that. We don't actually have mechanisms for this. Yes, Elon Musk has got his startup venture exploring how we do this, but I suspect it's a little way off. But if we could read minds, that would be our solution. We could sort of match the technology's understanding of the user's context with what's going on in their mind. Now, I often come to this broad concept of responsive design when talking about this. Now, responsive design, many people now actually are aware of this, the context, the concept, but they tend to consider it as sort of synonymous with that thing where the layout of a website changes as you go on different devices. And that's its biggest manifestation as a concept, but it is actually so much more. The idea of responsive design is that you take sort of clues you can get through the technology as to what the user's context possibly is. You're trying to infer something there. So, this thing around the different sort of layouts on different devices, really what's going on there is the technology is giving us an idea of how big the window size is, and we use that as a proxy to the device. So we're sort of saying, well, if it's narrow and small, it's probably a phone. If it's big and wide, it's probably full screen on a desktop. It's a way of sort of trying to guess at what's going on in the user's mind and the context that they're working in. But actually, those capabilities, the technology capabilities, are getting much more sophisticated. So, across most browsers now, you can do things like identify whether someone's got a touch interface or a keyboard or mouse. You can start to pick up things like color preferences even. You can check what the battery level is. You can start to get an idea of how good their network connection is. And lots of those are sort of clues you can take as to the context, the environment that user's in, and therefore potentially tweak and change the application to bleed into that and use that as a tool. But all those are very, very generic concepts, very generic technology clues. In theory, if we could get to something much more domain specific or much more detailed, then we could start to infer a lot more detailed insight about the user's context. And we got good enough at that, it could start to look like mind reading. And then we can start to do the hard work for the user instead of getting them to have to tell us every single time and waste so much time doing that. And that's the sort of concept around the broad vision around this integrated desktop notion. It's the idea of moving away from these sort of disjointed, brittle collection of fairly blunt, isolated tools into something more of an ecosystem, something that has more aid to what the user is actually trying to do. It embraces their world a bit more. It becomes that sort of empowering assistant that we always want our tools to be, rather than just the painful window that we have to deal with. So a big part of this sort of ecosystem type of thinking, this integrated type of thinking, comes down to recognizing that there is this broader intent from users beyond whatever it is that you're trying to deal with, probably. There's probably something before it, there's probably something after it, and you're just one step in a broader flow. So how do we start to tackle that idea? How do we start to get an idea of what the broader flow is? How do we start to get those contextual clues to kind of do our sort of mind reading trick? How do we start to get a handle on these flows that are going on there? And lots of people very sensibly run towards just mapping out those flows. There's lots of different techniques and tools for doing this. You can do user journey mapping, you can do flow diagrams, you can do user flows, you can do all sorts of things, task flows and the like. And they all work. They're all very helpful. My experience of them, and I've used pretty much everyone out there, is that while they serve a purpose, they do have some fairly clear assumptions about there being very neat beginnings and ends to things. The kinds of complex systems that we tend to deal with don't have neat starts and ends. They end up with the kind of soup you're seeing here in front of you, where things go all over the place, and it's much more complicated than a simple single journey, and you end up with insane levels of branching if you start to really try and map it out. The other issue I often have with some of these sort of broad flow mapping techniques is that they tend to focus on the big picture rather than the details. So you end up with something like this, and it's now impossible for anyone but the person who produced the diagram to meaningfully start to question it or try and find opportunities in it or argue it or whatever it is. It just, there's so much going on there. It also takes a lot of time. And it gets messy, and for all of those kind of reasons, people either put constraints on it, and the moment we put constraints on it and we say, look, nothing before that or after that, you're immediately breaking this notion that there is a before and an after. the moment we start doing that, it starts to lose the impact, the power that these tools can have, in my opinion. And to be honest, ultimately, my concern with these flows is best summed up by this guy. His reaction to that sort of flow mapping in our world, works potentially fine for a consumer world, but in our world of complexity, I try to do my best approximation of that face whenever people start to suggest it. What I like to advocate for is something much more focused, trying to narrow down the problem space that you're trying to tackle. Recognize that there's stuff you don't know, and don't fight it, don't ignore it, but embrace it, that this stuff, and it's not my problem today, might be my problem tomorrow, it might not be, it might be someone else's problem. But right now, I want to focus on a step in this. You don't need to care about the big whole. This gives us an ability to look into the details and not get distracted by everything else that's going on. And the way I like to do that, and the way sort of the aid that I've developed for myself over years of doing this, is something I'm sharing here. This what I've called a flow step canvas. Now, this sort of structure is it's not your answer. It's just an aid. It's a structured aid to try and help you think through this kind of problem in this particular mindset. And typically, this ends up as drawn on a wall or a whiteboard or a big piece of paper with post-it notes all over it, or in these days of having to do everything remote, we might use Miro boards or something similar. But I've put a copy of sort of this canvas, an A2 version of it with instructions in the handouts for this webinar, so you can grab that afterwards and play with this to your heart's content. I'll walk through what this canvas is all about and how this gives you that sort of structured approach to thinking through in the sort of flow mindset, but without getting lost in the monumental problem that is the full flow. So the first step's nominally the easy one. We have to give it a name. We have to say, well, what is this step we're looking at? And because I like to go after the really glamorous parts of our types of system, I'm going to do a worked example as we go along, and I'm going to focus on checking risk, because that's the exciting area that I want to go into today. So we've named it, great. You can actually fill out this canvas in any order, but I'm going to show you the way I tend to do it. So first of all, we try and fill in this actions box. So what's the user expecting to do in this step? What were they intending? What's conceptually, what is this thing? So checking risk, maybe we have a person that says, okay, they're trying to get some kind of overview of their exposure, and then they potentially want to be able to drill into specific details around that exposure to try and get some more information if they want. There's probably other stuff in there. I'm staying quite high level here just to keep everyone on board. So the next step then is, okay, this information box. What information do our people need to be able to do those actions? Okay, so potentially they need some kind of exposure measures that match whatever their asset class is that they're dealing with, some kind of notion of the risk tolerance levels, and then I put a pink post-it note in there because the other bit of information that's very relevant here is some broader sort of background view of live market data. So you're trying to get an idea of where the market's moving, because that obviously has an impact on how you might use your risk tolerance levels and exactly how you address this. So while the live market data might not be sort of direct information related to checking risk, it is indirect, and hence I've just given it a different post-it color. You can do this in lots of different ways, lots of different color post-its. I'll explain a few other ways in a minute. So that gives us this step. This is now a thing that could be designed, implemented as a screen, or a bit of a screen, or an app in itself, or split across many apps. But conceptually, from the user's point of view, we've now kind of captured an idea of what they're trying to do at this part of the process. But I mentioned we can't forget about flows, right? We have to think about where were they before this? What's the context? Why are they coming to this? What might be relevant here coming into it? So potentially before this, they were doing some analysis of trades, or they were trying to enter a trade, or maybe they just sat down at their desk first thing in the morning and just wanted to get an idea of where things stood. Those could be all sorts of other bits and pieces. But what's the context that comes with those potential entry points into this step? Well, I wouldn't say there's something sort of like directly risk related that tends to come into it, but there is sort of broader context, right? They might have some open orders, or either directly or indirectly from that infers some instruments that they're particular interest that are floating around in their mind at the moment, or a particular asset class. There's some context that they've got going on in their mind. They're not just checking risk because they like to look at numbers to do with risk. It is to inform them around some context that they've established elsewhere, likely. So I've done those in pink again, just because they're sort of broad picture stuff rather than specifically to do with this step. And then where are they going after this? They've done this step. What's next, or what has this triggered them to do potentially? Well, maybe they need to go and do more analysis because what they were hoping for doesn't quite work, or they've got some further questions in their mind. Maybe they can place the trades, or they can accept the orders, whatever it is. The whole bunch of different routes they could go off the back of that. These are just some examples. But again here, what's the context they're taking with them from this step? So that sort of instrument and the open orders and the asset class context that came in, effectively it flows through this step. It's relevant on the way out as well, but something's been added to that, and there's some notion of the available risk tolerance that they've got in their context now. Their mind has some notion of that. Now they could be looping from this step to another step and back again, over and over and over again within seconds or minutes. But this picture is building up, and in this particular step, the only thing we add to their context is some notion of available risk tolerance. But now we're starting to think in terms of a flow, right? We thought about before and after, and what are we doing here? It's given us this context, and it starts to give us ideas for sort of how we might, improve or implement this in a more useful way to that context. We might be able to infer from the context, oh, well, if they're looking at these instruments, well, let's just make sure that in terms of the exposure we're conveying, we bubble up specifically related to those instruments, rather than making them filter through lists or whatever it is. But ultimately here, when you have a canvas like this is some snapshot in time. It's just a thinking aid. You iterate this stuff, you evolve it. Don't turn this into some beautiful finalized documentation and say this is fact. No, this is to help get the creative juices flowing. I mean, one example, when I ran through this with a colleague the other day, this specific example, he called out, well, actually, you know what? What if you're on a client-facing desk and the trader gets an inbound call? That's where they're coming from, is they're on a call with a client. And so suddenly this context is now slightly broader. They've got a client-specific view of this world, potentially. Well, that starts to impact those actions in the middle. Instead of just getting an overview of exposure in a sort of generic way, well, potentially they want to be able to see, well, their trading desk exposure, but also a client-specific exposure, because that might be quite a different conversation they're having with the client, depending on that specific angle. Well, in the context of the client then carries on with them beyond that, most likely, unless they hung up the phone, but that's probably another step. So you can see how this sort of iteration and evolution then starts to build up and change that picture. But at no point are we tying this to technologies or systems specifically. We're just trying to get into the user's mind, but it gives you the opportunity to spot things you might not consider otherwise. Now I've kind of presented this as though it's very much greenfield thinking, but even if you're looking at existing workflows of users and you're trying to understand what they currently do, you could use this same approach, and maybe use different post-it notes to represent different systems, right? And then you can sort of have a map at the end where you're going, okay, well, all the yellow post-it notes are system X, all the blue ones are system Y, and all the red ones are system Z, and therefore now across all these steps we can start to get a picture of how sort of messy and blurry they are, or how useful they are. It's lots of different ways you can use that. But this then feeds in potentially into this broader understanding of the flow. Any one of these boxes in here is in effect that map, right? We've started to see that there's some context coming in, there's a before and there's an after, and there's a thing that's happening right now, but we've got some real detail and insight around it. This potentially, if you've got steps that nominally are before and after each other in the user's flow, you might notice that the context doesn't quite align, or our understanding of the context doesn't quite align. So there might be something you need to fix or change there. For those of you who are familiar with state machines, this is sort of a state machine type of modeling approach, right? We're we're acting as though we can map what's going on in the user's mind and move it through these steps. But actually, yes, that's exactly what we want to do. So that's why the tool is so powerful. So this is a lot of conceptual stuff, and this is understanding the users. But how does this translate a little bit into the technology side of things? Because that is relevant. For all that I say is the easy part, it is very, very important. Now, I've seen many organizations try and build applications, platforms, frameworks, whatever you want to call it, that let them sort of slot in these steps and manage all of them. I'm always wary of that approach, or at least that mindset. The intent's lovely, but the reality is, in my view, they tend to end up with something like this. Constraints come into play at some point, right? No organization can do everything the best way possibly. You tend to find that some of the tools and the frameworks and the platforms we created start to constrain what we're allowed to do, and you do your best. But yeah, give this to a master craftsman and watch him laugh or quickly lose fingers. Probably, it doesn't work. You aren't necessarily the expert of all these tools. I need to recognize that there's something broader that you might want to take a part of, right? You want to be able to use the best tools out there, give those to your users, and you want to be able to use them in a flow that they're the center of, not your technology. Sometimes, well, much like in this workshop I'm showing here, sometimes the tool you want to use is some ancient thing that's still loved or needed or serves its purpose. It has a place. Sometimes there's new shiny stuff you've got, and that's the exciting bit that we tend to get most excited about, but we shouldn't forget about the other bits. And oftentimes there's third-party tools, right? Stuff that you haven't built, stuff that someone else has. For all that we love to rail against it, Excel and Bloomberg aren't going anywhere. They're part of users' workflows. They serve a real purpose for our users, and we should embrace them and make them part of the ecosystem instead of constantly trying to battle them. Now, fortunately, there are a number of technology vendors who share this vision of the integrated desktop and this ecosystem of applications. And that means a lot of the technology-wise, the hard work's been done for us in some ways. They have a whole bunch of different tools and features across each of these different vendors that are very relevant to this vision. But the most empowering one to me, which is the one that's universal to them, is this notion of interoperability. So, in technical terms, a bus that's sitting there on the desktop that crosses all the containers that are out there. So, you can get legacy apps speaking to this bus. You can get your new fancy desktop container web-based apps. You can get things from the browser. You can get third-party systems. They can all talk through this single interop bus. It gives you an opportunity to send messages between all these different apps and these containers. And so actually, the way I see that is, well, it's a place to publish context. It's a place to be part of an ecosystem. That stuff that was coming into our map here that we were showing, well, you know what, that those pink post-it notes on the bottom left, that context is something we could potentially pick up from that interoperability bus. If other parts of this ecosystem are playing nice with us, then they throw that information out there. We should play part in that as well. If I were suggesting we implement this, that yellow post-it note in the bottom right, the available risk tolerance context, is something that we should be publishing onto that interoperability bus so that the ecosystem can start to recognize that. But where that's powerful is it's a very soft, loose integration point. That interop bus is just a pub sub mechanism. It doesn't impose technology on you. It doesn't force you to use certain APIs or certain technologies. It is really as neutral as it can get in that sense. So in technical terms, I kind of think we're there or thereabouts. The problem is more that ecosystem. We need lots of different people to play ball here, right? We need different people within our organization to play ball with one another. That can be hard. We need different organizations to play ball with each other. That can also be really hard, because while it's a loose interconnectivity, there is some interconnectivity. Now, fortunately, there's a body out there looking at this specific problem of creating standards around this interoperability. So the Finos organization, which is now part of the Linux Foundation, is all about open source in the financial domain, and they have a program called FDC3, and I can never remember what the three C's are, so I'm not even going to try and remember what the title stands for. But this working group is focused on an open standard around that interoperability, and you can read more about it on that URL. In fact, you can go and participate in that program by following the instructions in that URL. But ultimately, what they're trying to do there is they're defining a standard API. So, regardless of those vendor products I mentioned before, or whether you want to roll your own, if we all adhere to this API, we can live in one ecosystem. But they also then creating standards around what they term intent. So, standardized verbs to instruct other applications to do something. So, one application can say, chart this instrument for me, please. It doesn't have to do the charting. It can assume something else on the desktop does that. But for me, even more powerfully, there's standards around that context sharing that we've talked about in this, that I've been talking about here. It potentially allows us to eliminate that notion for rekeying information, to share what's going on in someone's mind, even if our part of our step in that flow isn't concerned with something else that's going on. We still can infer what's going on in the user's mind from that. Now, that's as much as about the technologies I want to go into. I plugged it at the start, I'll plug it again. There's a whole bunch of technical webinars and information in this white paper that my colleague Colin Eberhardt wrote, that you can go and get from there. And I'd encourage you to do that if this is of remote interest. Lots of good stuff there. So what I wanted to do to just wrap up, my big message here is that you need to play your part, and you need to play your part, first and foremost for the users. You need to recognize that probably whatever you're working on is just a step in a broader flow. It is not the destination. There's a from, there's something before it, there's an after, something too. And along that way, they need to be able to bring that context and information along with them. And we need to embrace that instead of fighting it. And secondly, you need to play your part as one player in this broader technology ecosystem. So again, whether that's within your organization or more widely, I strongly encourage you to at least adhere to, but ideally contribute to those FDC3 open standards. Or if you're working with third-party vendors, make them do it as well, right? Between us all, we can solve this problem much better for our users than we can individually. And to my mind, that is a key component of cultivating tomorrow's integrated desktop ecosystem. So that's all I was going to talk about just now. I will hand back to Claire, and then we will do questions after that.